the crimes that the Iraqi government carried out as a result of that. In the popular conscience of a lot of people, that's something that happened very, very far away that in world history, and it's right to commemorate something that's like that. Now, if you start talking to people that are in the political or military establishment, they're more aware of what was going on at the time, and when you have a display like this, it is certainly something much more significant to them, and that's probably the most important person you want to reach with something like this, to send that message to the imperialist powers that we have foiled your plots in the past, and we can do it again. And I think that's a powerful message to send them, to remind them that you've tried before and you failed. And I think that's important when we look at the global situation right now, with the way Canada, the US, the UK, and other countries, Australia, etc., are treating Iran in this current state of hostility towards the Islamic Republic. And the fact that this parade commemorating these events comes at this time is very interesting because of these hostilities that are being brought about by the country. So you get this reminder of the victory over previous hostilities as these new ones are now in this most dangerous new phase since the U.S. decided to send more U.S. troops and anti-missile systems to both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So I think that's pretty significant in itself. And I'm sure this is a point of pride for many of the Iranian people who have been suffering as a result of many of these sanctions that the United States has placed on the country, blockades, things like that, blocking medicines, which is simply unconscionable. And when you do have a time like that, I mean, I couldn't imagine what it's like to live in that kind of situation, but I imagine at a time like that, you would a celebration of resistance is something that probably a lot of people would need and would feel really good about. So the timing of all of this and the uplifting of the national spirit during a time of hardship, and I imagine this has been very hard on them, is probably something that's probably making a lot of people feel really good right now. This is very much a rebuff to the hostilities that the United States and others have been pushing.
Thank you, Jason. Of course, you touched upon something very, very interesting. That was the timing of the parade this year. I'm going to hold you there because we're going to get back to Tehran, where our correspondent, again, from the scene of that parade is joining us. So let's just switch to Tehran, to where Yusuf Jalali, our man, is standing. See what he has for us. Yusuf.
Well, Arash, it's been 2 hours since the beginning of the large-scale military parades marking the beginning of the 1980 to 1988 Iraqi post-war on Iran. And right now, as you see behind me, a wide range of tactical vehicles and military equipment are being put on display by the Iranian army and, of course, the Iranian IRGC forces. A wide range of tanks, personnel carriers, and armored vehicles are making a very long line to be put on display on this very important occasion in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is not the only place where we can see such a variety of military equipment being put on display. The entire country is, of course, marking this major occasion. And as you know, Iran has been under 4 decades of arms embargo, and all these military equipment that you see displayed behind me come despite the arms embargo, 4 decades of arms embargo that has been put by the United States against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is very significant given the fact that Iran has been trying to develop its own domestic military equipment to protect its sovereignty against any possible aggression. And that is why the Islamic Republic says that it seeks no permission to develop and build up its arsenal of defense equipment because the country has gone through the longest war of the 20th century. Iran went through that war, which was imposed in the 1980s by the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, a war that was supported by several countries against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Islamic Republic stood alone in the battlefield against the Iraqi forces. But despite that, Iran emerged victorious, and as put by the Iranian officials, Saddam Hussein could not occupy even an inch of the Iranian soil, and that was a lesson to the Iranian officials. They say that this was a lesson for them to try to not rely on bots security, to not rely on weapons that are bought from different countries, and they keep saying this, and they say that unlike some regional countries who try to buy weapons from the United States and from the UK, Iran has been able to develop its own weapons, and as you see, the majority of these weapons, and nearly all of these weapons, are built domestically by the Iranian experts. After 4 decades of arms embargo, instead of remaining idle, the Iranian experts try to come up with their own ideas to build up the arsenal of defense equipment in the country. And right now, Iran claims that it is producing over 80% of its defense equipment, and that is very, very significant given the fact that all the pressures have been put by the United States and its allies against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is a very significant day for the Iranians, as it marks a very important day, the day when Iraq waged a full-scale war against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Iran had just been celebrating the victory of the Islamic Revolution in the 1979, which toppled the Pahlavi regime and established the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that is why Iranians continue to mark this day annually with a wide range of military equipment on display, and nationwide parades that are still going on across the country.
Thank you very much, Youssef Jalali. Speaking on that event, as well as some of the Iranian latest achievements in the field of military, I really like to appreciate your time, Youssef. As Youssef was speaking, in his background, of course, you saw some of the machinery as well as the latest achievements by Iran's armed forces parading right behind him. Of course, we're trying to give you as much images of those achievements as we can here on Press TV, both in order to showcase as well as familiarize you with a portion of Iran's armed forces capabilities. Before that, I was speaking to Mr. Jason Unruhe in Ontario, and we were speaking about the different aspects of this day. Of course, especially that basically putting the finger of blame on Iran on anything that basically happens in our region, and the importance in such a juncture for the Iranian nation as well as its military to basically maintain its might. Jason.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a very good time for this to be happening. It's very special, and this reminder of the domestically produced military technology reminds me of a study, a test that was done in 2002 called the Millennium Challenge, in which the United States had set up a 4-day simulation of what it would take to invade Iran. Now, during that time, obviously, the 2002 is much further back than we are now, and Iranian military technology has significantly improved since then. But even back then, during the Millennium Challenge, it was determined that the United States, if they had actually invaded Iran, their invasion would have only lasted about a week, and that by their calculations, their own calculations, they had determined that Iran was able to destroy all U.S. ships in the Gulf within 2 days, completely stopping the entire invasion.
And that's
now,
2002.
when we consider that, sorry,
and that's 2002.
yes,
Right.
when we consider that it was back then, if we consider the technology Iran has now, which is significantly improved, we're looking at an even more beneficial situation for Iran.
Of course, another important thing, Jason, is how the region considers this. Iranian officials basically saying today that the military might that Iran enjoys right now is not only to protect itself, it will also serve the interests of other friendly regional nations as well. In what way do you think a strong Iran can bring about security to the Middle East region?
One of the biggest things in terms of global security that can exist, at least in my opinion, and maybe the opinion of many others, is a deterrent against war. If the war never happens to begin with, then that's it's a much better situation, and it's much more de-incentivizing that kind of invasion. Many people point to the fact, usually this is looked at as the mutually assured destruction principle when it comes to nuclear weapons. In other words, it's a situation where everybody would lose. But when you're talking about more conventional forces that, say, exist in the Middle East, we're talking about making invading Iran or one of its allies such a miserable mess that the benefit would be massively outweighed by the cost. In other words, if the U.S. did decide to invade Iran or one of its neighbors, the amount of damage that Iran could do back, the amount of capability that Iran has to defend itself and its allies is so great that the U.S. would end up spending far, far more money, far more resources, and far more lives in trying to get that objective than they would essentially, in the end, get out of it. And the ability to defend yourself is obviously the greatest deterrent from being attacked to begin with. And we've seen the DPRK. That's why they have put so much effort into developing nuclear weaponry. Before that, they had massive amounts of artillery along the border designed to essentially destroy the capital city in the south if they were ever invaded. That great deterrent, that great ability to defend yourself, or more particularly with the case of Iran, who is much closer to their allies than, say, the DPRK is due to its geographical position. It's very important to make it known, and not just to make it known, but for it to be true, that you are not going to back down, that you will do something back if you're invaded. If one of your allies is attacked, you will do everything in your power to stand up to that kind of abuse. And that's what Iran really has, mostly with its domestically produced technology. That is why the U.S. has been debating on whether or not to attack Iran for the better part of say, 20 years or so. Probably could even go back as far as the Iranian Revolution. Will the invasion be worth the amount that it's going to cost to? Will the cost of the invasion outweigh the benefit that would come from it? And right now, as it stands right now, even so much as it stands back in 2002, the answer is no. The cost of going to war against Iran is greater than possibly any war in U.S. history in which they anticipated an early victory. Obviously, Vietnam was much more costly, but that was because they had lost the war, but they had also miscalculated on what it would take to take the country. And that's the real thing here. This is all a part of imperialism, and imperialism in the end is about profits. It's about getting hold of resources to exploit for profits, gaining access to markets in order to sell things for profits. So if it becomes a greater cost than it does as a benefit, then it's not profitable to go to war, no matter how much they may want to, no matter how much Iran remaining independent with its own influence and its own independence, and that irks the imperialists a great deal. But as much as that's true, in the end, war is really about money, and if the profit isn't there for it, then in the end, they will hopefully, if more rational heads prevail, the war will not happen.
Of course, you mentioned the profits. Of course, the United States being one of the largest, I believe, the largest benefactor, not the benefactor, actually, beneficiary of weapons sales around the world, mainly to some of the countries in the Middle East region. Again, mainly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. How successful do you think, as far as the sale is concerned? Of course, I'm sure it's been very lucrative for the U.S., but how successful in terms of operation, especially in light of the attacks that Saudi Arabia has been the subject to recently? How successful do you think this side of the deal has been for Saudi Arabia?
Well, recently we did get reports of the U.S. manufactured systems not living up to their promises. And when you make military purchases that are in the hundreds of billions of dollars, I'd be pretty upset if they didn't live up to that kind of price tag. Obviously, Saudi Arabia doesn't have very much in terms of domestic production of military hardware. Obviously, their economy is focused much more towards energy production, and thus they have to buy it from many countries, the U.S., Canada, the U.K., etc. And particularly for the United States, it is very heavily, their economy is very heavily dependent upon weapons manufacturing. And the only way you can sell somebody weapons is if they need them. And in order to do that, you need to incentivize going to war. And when you've got countries like Iran that stand up the United States, you've always got some reason or another to try to do so. And all you need is a justification for doing it. Now, I think recently we saw that what Saudi Arabia has in terms of missile defense, really doesn't really work all that well. As we saw, half of their oil production was taken out, and it, I believe, is still out to this very day. So whatever missile defense systems the Saudis have right now, obviously were not as effective as they had previously claimed. Now, I believe it was bin Salman, but I could be wrong, who went out into the public maybe a day, maybe 2 days before the actual Yemeni attack, and had stated that that Saudi Arabia was safe from any kind of major attacks by the Houthis. The Houthis were too underdeveloped. They were too far away. They didn't have that kind of capability. And what we have a day or two later is a very serious response to that kind of arrogance coming out of the kingdom. And that was, let's face it, that was pretty embarrassing for the leaders inside of Saudi Arabia to act as though that nothing could happen to them, and then one of the worst things that can happen to them suddenly strikes them, and something that was big enough this time for the world to pay attention. Obviously, the loss of all these Yemeni lives were not enough for the world to pay attention, but affecting the gas price in this way was certainly enough.
Jason, a lot of people may doubt or basically talk about the Iranian defense capabilities as unnecessary. But don't you think, and please tell our viewers, that just like President Rouhani mentioned, if it wasn't for the Iranian armed forces, Iraq and Syria would have been in the hands of Daesh and ISIS today?
I think that is absolutely true. I mean, obviously every country, regardless of who they are, where they are, they have a right to defend themselves from any kind of aggression. And when you're a country that's not allied to the United States, you need that ability even more so than those that are allied to the United States. Now, it's very clear that Iran has put considerable effort into putting down the Daesh forces around the entire Middle East, which is something that the world really needs to have happen, not just for the sake of the countries that are being assaulted by Daesh, but just in terms of general humanity, just in terms of I can't think of any other word to describe it than humanity. These people, well, there's a lot of words we could use to describe them, do definitely need to be stopped. And they were something that the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel were highly counting on to be a major force in toppling the Syrian government, to place it in the hands of pro-U.S. institutions, or at least pro-U.S. forces, and they did not get that. And it has been a tremendous cooperative effort among many groups to push back, primarily Daesh, also Al-Qaeda inside of Syria, and many other U.S. allied and U.S. funded groups inside there. And this no doubt irks many of the imperialists who were hoping to watch this fall. One of the most elite publications in the world, The Economist, on the cover of one of their probably, I think it was their latest issue, lamented Bashar al-Assad's victory in this case. And it has been a great thorn in the side of the United States. And this is because of the development of Iran to help many of these countries who are being assaulted by the let's call them the real axis of evil: the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jason Unruhe. As always, I really appreciate your contribution to our discussion and the show. Of course, that basically brings this live coverage of the commemoration of Iran's the anniversary of Iran's Sacred Defense Week to an end. I really appreciate your time, viewers, for being with Press TV and watching us. A gist of what happened today will definitely be within the conductors of our news bulletins that will be aired throughout today and perhaps tomorrow. For now, let me just say that in Tehran, where Press TV is, it's 10:17 a.m., which means, by the way, that I'll be back in 13 minutes with a review of what's been happening in your world today. So until then, stay with us, and I see you.
You mentioned Iran being the greater offender in the eyes of the U.S. and the West, and that's true, I believe. At the time, at least, it was true. And perhaps still. Yes. Because till today,